What if I told you three working-class kids from Flint conquered stadiums faster than the Beatles? 55,000 tickets in 72 hours. Then came the instruments seized backstage at Madison Square Garden. A manager stealing millions, lawsuits freezing their empire. They survived, but the betrayal split them forever. Decades later, they'd be fighting over the very name that once united them. This is the crushing story of brotherhood, destroyed by the very system that made them legends. Flint, Michigan, the late 1960s, factory towns, steel mills. This was the landscape that shaped Mark Farner on guitar, Don Brewer on drums, and Mel Shocker on bass. Not privileged kids dreaming from their parents' living rooms. These were working-class boys who understood labor, sacrifice, and persistence. They had no backup plan. Rock and roll wasn't an option. It was survival. Farner and Brewer had played together in the Pack, chasing the guitar and drum sound that was reshaping rock and roll in the late 60s. But the Pack was incomplete. When they brought in Shocker from Question Mark and the Mysterians, a bassist who could lock into a groove with the precision of a machine, something crystallized that none of them had anticipated. 3 instruments, no keyboards, no orchestral arrangements. Pure, unapologetic force. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. They envisioned a power trio that could match Cream's sonic intensity and Jimi Hendrix's raw energy, but filtered through an American lens. Not the sophistication of British blues interpretation, not the experimental freedom of psychedelia, pure American muscle, the kind of sound that came from factory towns and Saturday night bars. They wanted to prove that rock and roll didn't require a British accent or a university education. The name arrived with perfect clarity: Grand Funk Railroad, a direct reference to the Grand Trunk Line cutting through Michigan, a landmark as essential to the region's identity as the factories themselves. Not designed to impress critics, it was a statement of purpose. Grand Funk Railroad, we move things, we cannot be stopped. Then Terry Knight entered the picture. A former DJ who had secured a producer's contract with Capitol Records, Knight positioned himself as the bridge between these 3 hungry musicians and the record industry establishment. He promised access. He offered guidance. He presented himself as a partner in their dream. What he actually became was their architect of control. Before they even signed a record deal, Knight had positioned himself as the sole gatekeeper, controlling all access, information, and negotiations with the industry. Record labels quickly discovered they couldn't speak directly to the band. They had to go through Terry Knight. This structural arrangement created a fundamental imbalance that would eventually consume them. From the moment they signed, the trap was already constructed. July 1969, the Atlanta International Pop Festival. Grand Funk was granted a surprise, unpaid slot on a bill so crowded with legendary acts that they were effectively invisible. Janis Joplin was headlining. Creedence Clearwater Revival, Johnny Winter. The festival drew thousands of rock fans, but Grand Funk was positioned as filler, the band nobody came to see. Then they took the stage. The raw force of their performance, the sheer volume, the stripped-down intensity, shocked the crowd into stunned silence before erupting into recognition. Mark Farner recalled the moment with clarity. This was a band channeling the industrial roar of Michigan into something that had never quite existed before. They didn't just perform, they obliterated. Word of the performance spread through the underground rock circuit like electricity. Capitol Records, watching the industry buzz, signed them within weeks. Their debut album, On Time, released in August 1969, became a phenomenon that confused the music establishment. It peaked at number 27 on the Billboard charts, but sold over 1 million copies. Gold certification. This contradiction, critical invisibility coupled with massive grassroots success, defined their entire career from this moment forward. Radio programmers turned a deaf ear. Major music critics dismissed them as too loud and simple, yet fans converted themselves at live shows night after night, driven by the visceral power of encountering this sound in person. A song emerged from their early catalog that would resonate across an entire generation. I'm your captain, I'm your captain. I'm your captain. For Vietnam veterans returning to an America that didn't want to see them, this song became something sacred. For working-class Americans feeling abandoned by a changing country, and a music industry that didn't speak their language, it was a lifeline. The irony was crystallizing. The band the establishment was ignoring had become the voice of millions. By 1971, Grand Funk Railroad had transformed from underdogs into something unprecedented. They weren't the most technically proficient musicians. They weren't critical darlings. They were the biggest touring rock act on the planet, period. Every concert was a sold-out explosion of energy. Thousands of people gathering to be moved by three men and their instruments. The pinnacle came on July 9, 1971, Shea Stadium, New York. The venue that had defined the Beatles era and cemented the concept of the stadium rock concert. 55,000 tickets, sold out in 72 hours, faster than any band in history, faster than the Beatles themselves had achieved. When Mark Farner arrived by helicopter that day and looked down at the massive venue, he witnessed something that still defied belief decades later. The crowd was so dense, so energized, so physically moving that the entire stadium appeared to be bouncing. Not metaphorically, literally, the sight was surreal. Farner later reflected on the impossible nature of their dominance. There were no hit singles. It was all underground radio that we were getting played on. Radio programmers had written them off. The record industry had deemed them unmarketable. Yet they had conquered the world's biggest rock venue through pure connection with their audience. Nothing else, no radio support, no critical validation. Just three men and millions of people who believed in them. Beneath this triumph lay a silent catastrophe unfolding in the shadows. Terry Knight had produced all their major selling albums, and he owned the master recordings. He controlled the revenue streams. While three working-class men were generating an empire through relentless touring and genuine creative power, their manager was systematically siphoning wealth away, constructing a financial system designed to benefit him through their hard work. They were standing at the absolute peak of their power, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was already collapsing. The discovery arrived like a punch to the gut in 1972. Grand Funk finally examined the numbers and realized the terrible truth. Terry Knight had kept nearly 3 times what the band earned. For every dollar Grand Funk generated, Knight extracted a fortune. The three men who had built this empire through sweat and touring were surviving on scraps while their manager accumulated wealth that should have belonged to them. The betrayal crystallized into action. Grand Funk fired Knight immediately. There was no negotiation, no attempt at compromise. Knight's response was swift and devastating. He filed a $57 million lawsuit, an amount designed purely for destruction, not reasonable negotiation. Pure annihilation, and it worked perfectly. The lawsuit had immediate consequences. Bank accounts froze instantly. Royalties vanished into a legal black hole. Every dollar they had earned through years of touring, living on buses, and sacrificing their bodies and voices became suddenly inaccessible. They couldn't access their own money. They couldn't pay their bills. They were financially paralyzed by the very system they had succeeded within. For three men who believed in honest labor, losing their earnings was more than disaster. It was the American dream turned against them. But the worst moment was still coming. December 23, 1972, Madison Square Garden. Grand Funk was scheduled to play a sold-out benefit concert for Phoenix House, a drug rehabilitation center. Thousands of fans were already seated in the arena, waiting to hear the band that had changed their lives. Minutes before they were due to take the stage, Terry Knight arrived with sheriff deputies and a court order authorizing seizure of their instruments and equipment as partial payment for his lawsuit. Knight pointed at their gear, the guitars that had shattered stadiums, the drums that had powered a generation, the amplifiers that had changed the sound of rock and roll, and announced with cold precision, "Those are mine." Backstage, the three members of Grand Funk faced an impossible choice: cancel the show and risk triggering riots among the thousands of disappointed fans, or play and watch everything they owned be confiscated the moment they walked off stage. A desperate compromise was brokered in frantic negotiation. They would play the show. They would deliver everything the audience came for. But Knight and his crew would be waiting backstage to haul away every piece of equipment the moment the final note was struck. After pouring their hearts out for thousands of people, after delivering a performance, after giving everything they had to their audience, They would then watch their life's work be seized like a debt collector claiming furniture. Knight later reflected on his intentions with chilling clarity. He wanted to give them a lesson that they weren't fooling with a fool. He wanted to humiliate them in front of their fans. And he succeeded. The legal battle dragged on for months afterward. Finally, in February 1974, the nightmare concluded with a settlement agreement. Grand Funk would be permitted to keep their name, essential for any future touring, but the price was everything else. They forfeited the publishing rights to their entire early catalog of monster hits. I'm Your Captain, Foot Stompin' Music, every song that had connected with millions of people. They no longer owned them. They would never receive royalties from them again. The loss of income combined with frozen assets meant their only path to financial survival was immediate, desperate commercial success. They had no safety net, no fallback plan. They had to succeed instantly or face financial ruin. And they had no choice but to transform into something they had never intended to become. Desperation is a powerful creative force, but it's also destructive. Grand Funk needed immediate commercial success to survive. They turned to producer Todd Rundgren for an album called We're an American Band in 1973. Rundgren was brilliant at crafting commercially viable rock, hooks that stuck in your head, production values that sounded polished on FM radio, arrangements designed for airplay and chart positioning. This wasn't about preserving their raw power. It was about profit. It was about survival. Don Brewer explained the brutal logic that had replaced their artistic ideals. FM radio was changing from FM underground to the hit format, and we had to make the transition. Our very career and financial lives depended on it. The calculus was harsh and undeniable: artistic purity or financial destruction. There was no third option. The result was immediate commercial success. The title track, We're an American Band, released in July 1973, became their first #1 single on the Billboard charts. It was a lifeline thrown to 3 drowning men. For a moment, the nightmare seemed survivable, but survival came with a price that tore at the heart of what Grand Funk had always been. Mark Farner felt the shift in his bones. The power trio format, 3 instruments, pure force, no keyboards, had been sacred to him. It was the foundation of their identity. But Brewer and Shocker voted to add keyboardist Craig Frost to the band in 1973. Farner was outvoted. The power trio was ending. The sound was being reshaped into something more polished, more commercial, less raw. Subsequent albums delivered more hits. The Locomotion hit #1, Bad Time. In 1975, reached #4 on the Billboard charts. From a commercial perspective, Grand Funk was thriving, but Don Brewer himself would later describe Bad Time with honest reflection. Very pop, sugary, sweet, syrupy. This was the sound of artistic compromise at its most complete. The songs that had once connected with war veterans and working-class Americans, raw, honest, unmistakably authentic, had been replaced by something designed specifically for radio rotation and chart positioning. The core fans who had discovered them at the Atlanta Pop Festival, who had stood in the crowd at Shea Stadium and felt that physical bouncing of the stadium, felt the betrayal. Not because Grand Funk had intentionally betrayed them, but because the music industry had forced Grand Funk to betray themselves. The irony was devastating. The 3 men who had fought so hard to maintain artistic integrity in the face of critical dismissal, who had built an empire specifically by rejecting establishment preferences, were now sacrificing that very integrity to survive the financial destruction caused by their own manager. Internal creative battles intensified. The exhaustion from years of legal trauma mounted. The exhaustion from the forced transformation accumulated. By late 1976, something broke inside Don Brewer. He made a declaration that shattered everything. I'm over it, man. It's over. We're through. The original Grand Funk Railroad lineup disbanded. Brewer and Frost found stability and creative fulfillment, joining Bob Seger's Silver Bullet Band. Mark Farner attempted solo work. three brothers walked away from each other, broken by forces they couldn't control, and broken by what they had been forced to become in order to survive. By the mid-1990s, nostalgia was becoming a powerful force in the music industry. Classic rock radio was celebrating the 70s. Fans who had followed Grand Funk in their youth were now middle-aged and feeling nostalgic, hungry to experience that music again. In 1996, the original trio reunited. They began touring. The response was extraordinary. Hundreds of thousands of fans who had never forgotten, who still believed, who still wanted to hear those raw, powerful songs that had changed their lives decades ago. For 3 years, the reunion seemed to work. The fans were genuine. The connection was real. The wounds seemed to be healing. Then, 1998 arrived. Don Brewer approached Mark Farner with documents to sign. Brewer explained that the band needed to consolidate ownership of their trademark, the name Grand Funk Railroad, into a corporate entity as a protective measure. Farner trusted his lifelong bandmate. They had survived betrayal together. They had endured legal warfare together. They had been brothers in the truest sense. So, he signed. Only later did Farner realize what he had actually signed. He had transferred his individual ownership of the Grand Funk Railroad trademark into a corporation controlled entirely by Brewer and Shocker. The protective umbrella was actually a trap, one constructed by his oldest friends. With Farner's ownership stake dissolved into the corporate structure, Brewer and Shocker could legally vote him out of the band. They could exclude him from touring under the Grand Funk Railroad name. They could prevent him from using the brand he had co-created. Farner later reflected with bitter clarity, "I signed on the dotted line, and I signed the whole damn thing away." Today, the Grand Funk Railroad legacy is fractured into two separate worlds. Don Brewer and Mel Shocker continue to tour as Grand Funk Railroad with replacement musicians. Max Carl on vocals and Mark Chatfield on guitar. They play to crowds. They perform the songs. They carry the name. They are the version of Grand Funk that most casual fans will encounter. Meanwhile, Mark Farner tours separately as Mark Farner's American Band. He plays the same songs. He tells the same stories. He has the same emotional connection to the music, but he cannot use the name that was stolen from him. The tragedy runs deep. The irony cuts deeper. The very man who had created so many of the iconic songs, the one whose voice defined Grand Funk Railroad in the minds of millions of fans, is now excluded from the brand bearing his creation. Grand Funk Railroad proved American rock didn't need sophistication or critical approval to matter. Their songs still echo. Their spirit endures. But the brotherhood that created it, fractured by betrayal, divided by lawsuits, separated by legal maneuvering, may never reunite. What part of their story haunts you most? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories of rock's greatest triumphs and tragedies.